It's a real pleasure to be here, and I know that that's just a standard conference statement to make, but I really enjoy having an audience who I know actually care about what I'm going to talk about. And it's one of the reasons I was glad to leave the academy. I'm a recovering academic. If anyone doesn't know it yet, you're about to find out that I'm Larry's student. I got my PhD under his supervision at NYU, and sure enough, I have a lot of things to say that agree with my mentor's statements in his own presentation. But a little repetition is good for you, and I hope there won't be too much. Now, I start also with Hayek's bold plans, as all of us who talk about the subject of currency competition and privatization, we all go back to Hayek. We owe it to Hayek that this is a subject that is now considered relevant. And it's become more relevant, as Larry said, than ever as a result of the advent of cryptocurrencies. Now, when Hayek wrote about denationalization of money, choice in currency, and particularly private fiat monies, these ideas were essentially hypothetical. Of course, there was some choice in currency, but private fiat currency was something completely unknown, completely hypothetical, theoretical. As for denationalization of money, it wasn't quite hypothetical. It was hypothetical in the way Hayek envisioned it. But there had been substantially denationalized money systems of the past, not like what Hayek had in mind, but systems where bank-issued currencies pretty much were supplying the whole money stock. And even, and if you consider the fact that there have been private coins in the past, it's easy enough to envision an old-fashioned monetary system that was, in fact, completely denationalized. But it was a long time ago that we saw these cases of free banking. And so you could say that they, too, were largely hypothetical by the time Hayek wrote, that it was quite a leap of faith to imagine that there'd be any revival. So I hope my hosts won't consider it insulting if I summarize my view of Hayek's proposal back then as castles in the air. The advent of cryptocurrencies, again, has made these proposals less fantastic in the sense that the cryptocurrencies of various kinds represent real-world attempts by entrepreneurs to do what Hayek wanted to see done or hoped governments would allow to take place. But they are doing it without any government support and with some considerable opposition from governments, it should be said. Even so, I think we can learn from these experiments, these entrepreneurial attempts using cryptocurrencies to achieve something like private fiat money competition with established fiat standards, and also something like a revival of old-fashioned free banking systems. So what I'm going to do is look into them, ask how successful they've been, ask why their success has been limited, which of course it has been, and ask what they can teach us about the merits of Hayek's original ideas, and in what ways were they sound, and what ways were they not so sound. Let me quickly start with a review of Hayek's theories or proposals. First of all, private fiat money, probably the most radical of his suggestions. The theory, as Larry already did some summary work, very quickly, was that private firms, Hayek called them banks, but let's face it, these aren't banks in any normal sense of the term. They're not intermediaries. They're just businesses that supply money. And the money consists of, in Hayek's proposal, I suppose, paper instruments that were denominated in distinct novel currency units, independent of any existing currencies, And the issuers promised to maintain their purchasing power, and Hayek believed that as a result of competition among many such rival issuers, there would be pressure and incentives for them to keep their promises, to keep their money stable, and those that failed would drop out of this competition. And if central banks couldn't compete in that respect with the private issuers, they'd have to drop out of the business as well. So let the best man win, and so on. Now, Larry mentioned one of the more serious problems of Hayek's proposals, which is the problem of cheating, the time inconsistency problem, to put it in the technical language of economists, which is simply that even if a private issuer were successful, and this could be said about central bank issuers as well, if they are successful at gaining a considerable market for their currencies through the convincing people that they're going to maintain their stable purchasing power, perhaps by doing so for some time, then the profit incentives for cheating by just issuing oodles of the stuff and grabbing a huge profit right away can be very strong. And as a result, profit maximization doesn't necessarily give you the result that these currencies actually are stable. And of course, if people can anticipate that equilibrium outcome, then these currencies will simply not fly. They won't go off the ground. By the way, Larry, once again, has beat me to the punch here because he has the best essay on the problem of equilibrium stable private fiat currencies in his book on the theory of monetary institutions. There are other problems with Hayek's proposals as well, but it'll be easiest to shed light both on those problems and on some possible solutions by looking at what the cryptocurrencies have done. But before I do, I want to talk briefly about free banking. Now, free banking, as I said, was and has been in the past a vehicle for the denationalization of money. What I mean by that is simply that there have been cases, countries like Scotland, Canada, and others, where well-developed banking systems consisted not only of banks of deposit that we're used to still today, but of banks that issued their own convertible banknotes. Now, these aren't private fiat monies. These were notes that were redeemable claims to gold and silver, which were the standard monies of the countries in question. And the wide acceptance of these bank monies, the popularity of them, and that's the right word, extreme popularity relative to gold or silver coin, was such that most money balances consisted of those notes of commercial banks and deposits, which were less important back then, with very little gold and silver in circulation, remarkably little, and very low reserve ratios for the banks of issue. I mean, in Scotland in the 1820s, 1% or 2% of gold, with banks using lots of other secondary liquid reserves, but not very much precious metal. And again, if you just can envision, and it really shouldn't be hard for you to do so, private factories making the little metal discs that, and the ingots that are actually used as reserves, well, then you've got a perfectly, completely denationalized monetary system. So denationalization of money is possible, it's happened, and it's happened in some cases quite successfully relative to other systems that existed in those times. Private fiat money hasn't happened, no historical basis for it. Now, I want to say a couple more things about free banking. First of all, it's not Hayek's proposal. It has been in the past a means for denationalization of money, that's true. But Hayek himself never argued for free banking. In fact, he argued against free banking. He didn't like the idea. In some places, very explicitly dismissed it. Along lines, by the way, extremely similar to those taken by Milton Friedman at one time in the past. Now, Friedman changed his mind later on. But Hayek considered, when he thought about letting banks issue their own money, like the early Friedman, he imagined that they were all going to issue exact copies of official paper money. And so it would be legalized counterfeiting. Of course, that would be result in inflation, because nobody could identify the specific firms that were supposed to be responsible for honoring the redemption pledges. But in real-world free banking systems, of course, the different banks of issue indicate on their notes who has issued the notes, and you know which bank is responsible for redeeming the notes. Just as today, if you write a check on the bank, you know, there's a certain bank that's responsible. It's not a collective liability. Anyway, it's odd that Hayek didn't recognize the reality of actual past free banking systems. I'm puzzled by it. Vera Smith was his student who wrote about those systems very well, but nevertheless, he dismissed free banking. But he inspired the research on free banking that came after his proposal. The theory, very quickly, what disciplines free banks is the fact that they are competing with each other. And the real key to this competition is the active redemption of their IOUs, not by the general public. It isn't that citizens say, oh, this banknote isn't worth as much as gold, so I'm going to redeem it. It's not arbitrage. It's simply the banks in the ordinary course of business returning the items from rival banks that they receive actively every day, sometimes more than once a day, depending on the clearing arrangement, and insisting on settlement of net dues in the base money of the economy, the reserve asset, which in those days was a gold or silver coin. The fact that there were many banks of issue participating in very well-developed clearing and settlement systems, which in those days involved private clearinghouses, today it's done by central banks in many places, is what kept these banks honest and allowed them ultimately to win the public's confidence. It was a consistent, as it were, testing of the willingness of each bank by its rivals to keep its promises, to honor its redemption commitments. That was the source of discipline. This is very important when we come to talk about modern cryptocurrency alternatives. Now, in all these, the last thing to say about free banking is that any free banking regime depends on an underlying base regime. In those days, you had to have a silver standard or a gold standard. Free banking, per se, doesn't give you any determinate inflationary process. Its performance, free banks can help stabilize the performance of any given base money medium through the elastic supply of their substitutes. They can't make up for a long-run trend if you have a gold standard that has, or supply shocks to which the base regime itself is subject. So if there's a gold discovery, the free banks are not going to make the inflation from that discovery go away, and so on. So free banking isn't itself an answer to the problems of getting the inflation rate correct, but it can help stabilize any given monetary base regime. All right, so now let's talk about cryptocurrencies and what they have taught us about all these theoretical ideas or historical ideas, starting with the most famous and the first, Bitcoin. The good news, and Larry covered this, the good news about Bitcoin is that it solves the commitment problem to which a Hayek-type private fiat money issuer would be subject. Instead of there being a mere promise, there's a computer algorithm that absolutely guarantees a certain supply behavior of the coins. That's the good news. And in doing this, in achieving this result, in solving that problem, Bitcoin also compels us to think about the alternatives we face as not consisting solely of commodity monies on one hand, which have built-in real scarcity, and fiat money on the other, where you have to rely on some kind of artificial commitment mechanism that's not built into the standard. We now have Bitcoin and a few other alternatives, all cryptocurrencies, that I call synthetic commodities, and the basis for synthetic commodity monies, because like commodities, their scarcity is inherent, though it's inherent because of the algorithm on which they're based. But like fiat monies, they are not natural. They're not scarce. They're not inevitably scarce because there's only so much of them in the ground or something like that. Anyway, this class of synthetic commodity monies, or potential synthetic commodity monies, solves a big problem with Hayek's proposal. And so brings us that much closer in that respect to realizing what he had in mind. The bad news is that they are only potential monies, and as Larry also mentioned, there's been very little uptake of Bitcoin, the most popular, as a medium of exchange. It's been successful as a vehicle for investment, for speculation, but as money, it's pretty much been a flop. And nothing illustrates this more than the hodler phenomenon. That's Hodler, which is a reference to the philosophy, as it were, in the Bitcoin community that says, never sell your Bitcoins, hold on to them, hodl them, because they're going to appreciate more. Well, this isn't just something people say, it's what many Bitcoin investors do in practice. And of course, you can either be a hodler or you can be a spender using this stuff as a medium of exchange. You can't be both. So the hodler phenomenon, it sort of highlights the overarching speculative investment demand for Bitcoin, which is really the basis of its success, where by success here we mean just big market, a growth of its market capitalization. But a good medium of exchange should be something that people find convenient to use for purchasing things. That's the story briefly with Bitcoin. I'll have more to say about some other problems with it, but there are two big lessons that it teaches us about Hayek's theory that I want to turn to. And they both are lessons that reveal other problems with Hayek's theory. So we had the problem of the credible commitment and the lack of it until the advent of algorithmic monies or synthetic commodity monies. But another problem in Hayek's theory, and Ottmar Issing mentioned this, and I was so glad to hear it because it's not brought up enough, is Hayek conflated the socially optimal with the individually optimal in the choices of financial assets and particularly potential monetary assets. And the hodler phenomenon is related to this as well. What it tells us, or what it hints at least, is that if you want to have your cryptocurrency, your free-floating cryptocurrency do well, you don't want to give people the expectation that it's merely going to maintain its purchasing power. If you really want it to be popular, you want to convince them that its purchasing power is going to improve over time, that it's going to appreciate, that it's going to give them a good investment return. And that's, of course, very different from the promise of the stable purchasing power, which rightly or wrongly Hayek assumed was what you really want to have a nice, well-performing alternative money. So if we have competition between Bitcoin and altcoins, which there are now many of, it isn't clear at all that the winner of this competition, and of course we can throw central bank fiat currencies in the mix as among the rivals, it isn't clear though that if it was just a question of the promised rate of return determining which money is going to win out, that it would be the money with stable purchasing power. It might well be the one that builds in a pretty nice rate of appreciation if it can. And so that's a problem. There is another problem, though, that's related to this, and it's particularly related to the lack of Bitcoin uptake. And Larry mentioned this too. This is the problem with going after your advisor, which is the network externality or network effect problem, and it's huge. Because so we have two problems. One, if people are interested in return, the competition is going to be won, if at all, by the high return asset, not the stable purchasing power asset. Right. But if it's a question of the best medium of exchange, then the most important factor driving people's choice is the size of the established exchange network. It's one thing if you're starting out with a bunch of altcoins that are at the same starting gate as in a horse race. And then we can say that the merits of the different coins are going to be the main thing determining which ones command the biggest market share and capitalization. But if they're competing with established fiat monies, with huge payment networks, then they face a very, very hard uphill battle gaining any kind of market share as exchange media relative to those. And Menger's theory is, I was going to say this too, Larry, very important here. Everyone in this room, I think, or almost all of you are familiar with Menger's theory, how it tells how we can have a natural evolution where something, when there's no money at all, and eventually the accumulated network growth of one item, one commodity, causes it to become a generally accepted medium of exchange. But that process is like a Chinese finger trap, where you can put your fingers in, but then you can't pull them out. Just as it's possible to have one money become dominant spontaneously, and it's also the case that once anything is dominant, whether it just won a Mengerian spontaneous horse race or governments interceded to make it so, it's very hard for anything to unseat it as the dominant money or to compete with it effectively. So it's very hard. It would be very hard, even for an otherwise attractive altcoin, to compete effectively as a medium of exchange with the bigger established fiat monies. It's different when you're competing with the Venezuelan currency or something like that, where they're both very bad and not particularly important. Then they have a better chance of gaining prominence, but only if dollars and other big network alternatives also are not able to compete against them. By the way, we have a very good test of the whole network phenomenon in El Salvador. Here's a country that has done everything possible, and some things that I think are not very nice, to make Bitcoin displace US dollars as the people's preferred medium of exchange, including some compulsory legislation. And yet, we now can see, after more than a year of this experiment, that the actual uptake of Bitcoin as a medium of exchange, even with the the Salvadoran government giving it quite a leg up, has been very, very disappointing. That is, disappointing to Bitcoin advocates, not so disappointing to the Salvadoran people, who never were very keen as a whole on these reforms. So if Bitcoin can't do very well in El Salvador under the circumstances, I think that shows pretty clearly how important network effects are. That is, the fact that the dollar is well entrenched there, that it is a bad currency, but not god-awful like some. And the people don't want to climb off the big bandwagon onto a tiny bandwagon, which is what Bitcoin is relative to the dollar. This brings us to stable coins, because what the network effect argument really tells us is that if you have a private currency and you want it to really compete with the established currencies, fiat currencies, the best way to improve its odds is to make it compatible with those currencies. Now, a compatible currency that's privately supplied, it doesn't suffer from the network advantage of the established fiat money, because you can plug it right into that network. It fits the network. Its attractiveness is the same as the attractiveness of the official fiat money, to the extent that it's perceived as a very close or superior substitute, denominated in the same units, otherwise as attractive in other respects. So stable coins have a potential to gain let's just say, a much easier road ahead of them when it comes to gaining ground against the dollars or euros or whatever fiat currencies they're supposed to mimic. They have an easier road ahead. Not an easy road, an easier road. By the way, I think it should be clear that the free banking currencies of the past all succeeded in displacing official government coins, or in some cases other kinds of official money, because they were completely compatible with them. They were, in essence, they were paper stable coins. The notes of the banks of Scotland were all denominated in British pounds. So they weren't trying to displace an established standard money. They were meant to be substitute representatives of the established standard money. And that's a much different strategy, if you will. Now, unfortunately, the record of stable coins has itself not been terribly good. So we must ask why. And here there are two kinds of stable coins that we have to consider. The first are so-called algorithmic stable coins, and the second are redeemable stable coins. Algorithmic stable coins work on the same, more or less, general basis as Bitcoin and other independent cryptocurrencies. There is a computer algorithm that is supposed to keep their value stable or equal to, stable in terms of or equal to that of the host currency or official currency they represent, or gold, because as we've seen, they're gold stable coins. But it's all done with computers. And so the success of those is really a technical matter of how well the algorithm works and whether it can do what it's meant to do. And so far, that success has been there hasn't been any. In fact, most of the really dramatic collapses of stable coins, all of them actually, have been of algorithmic stable coins. And it's important to recognize that, because the other sort of stable coins have done much better, and we shouldn't consider them all as dangerous or as capable of failing as the worst. Now, this is interesting because it shows how hard it is to design an algorithm for cryptocurrency that's macroeconomically clever, that can do fancy things. The Bitcoin algorithm, of course, only has to make the currency supply grow at a certain rate, and it's complicated and impressive enough at that. But getting an algorithm that's a little smarter macroeconomically, that just tries to link a cryptocurrency through a software to an existing fiat currency, there already the designers are finding it difficult to achieve what they want to achieve. Larry has talked about the proposal he's associated with to have a coin that isn't a stable coin in the usual sense, but that has a stable purchasing power, a true Hayek coin. But it remains to be seen, good luck, Larry, remains to be seen if that can work, because the challenge is much greater. And part of the problem, which Larry also mentioned, is such a coin has to respond to information from the economy, information that's changing all the time. It has to take into account changes in the real demand for money balances, or the output of goods and services, the real output in the economy, because those variables, of course, are among the factors that influence the purchasing power of any medium of exchange. So we'll see if that can be done, but it's much harder. I would like to see a stable coin that stabilizes nominal spending, personally, but I'm told by many people that that's not so easy, and I have no reason to doubt it. I mean, people who are involved in this kind of technology. As for redeemable stable coins, their record is much better than that of the algorithmics. And I'm mainly referring here to the US dollar stable coins because those have been by far the most popular. Yet even their record is far from perfect. Unlike the banknotes of past free banking systems, or the best of them, but most of them, these modern redeemable stable coins have not maintained constantly an exact stable value in terms of their host currencies. They vary to some extent. Their actual market values vary from their par values, sometimes only very slightly, but it's not perfect. Whereas if you went back to, again, Scotland, I could pick other examples, but I'll keep harping on it. In the 1820s and 30s, you would find that a Scottish banknote that was denominated £10 was always worth exactly £10, or the bank was failing, and then it was going to be worth a lot less, but those were the exceptions. A bank in good standing relied on, the success of these currencies depended on their compatibility with the established unit, and to the extent that they couldn't achieve that, it was very bad news for their issuers. Competition would punish severely any bank whose currency differed from par, of course, particularly if it was worth less than its par value. The redeemable stable coins haven't done nearly so well. Why is that? If you think about technology, or if you think about redemption, right, the issue that in principle a redeemable money can stay at the same value as the stuff it represents, as long as opportunities for arbitrage are there. Certainly, people can buy and sell and trade and exploit the difference between the face value, or the nominal value, the market value, and the par value of the currency. So what's going on with stable coins? Well, I think here the problem, most fundamentally, is that the conditions for free choice in currency that Hayek had in mind haven't been met. And I can put this, I think, most starkly by saying this is not so much a question of the currency playing fields in question not being level or being slanted in favor of official monies. It's more a question of the rival stablecoins not even being allowed to play on the same playing fields. Now, that's a metaphor, so let me unpack it for you. With ordinary currencies, both in the free banking systems of the past and today with, let's say, dollar-based bank currencies, the issuers, the suppliers of these currencies, all take part. I mean, except for the stablecoin community, the banks that are issuing the close substitutes for U.S. fiat dollars today compete on the same playing field, which is a playing field in which they constantly are settling accounts with each other through the active redemption of items from other banks, not banknotes, but debits and checks. And the Fed is now in the middle of all this, doing the actual settlements, but they all have accounts at the Fed, and so you have a very efficient clearing system in which is the clearing and settlement system, which is what I mean by the playing field on which these currencies, these rivals, these substitutes, ordinary substitutes for US dollars operate. That's where they compete. And that keeps them very efficient. Right? You can't, if a bank doesn't settle right away for every nickel it's responsible for, it has defaulted. It's as simple as that. There can't be a difference without a default, at least not a negative one. But the Federal Reserve, and it's not the only monetary authority doing this, the Federal Reserve has absolutely refused to let stablecoins participate in the same playing field. And the specific way they've done this is by not letting any stablecoin issuer, so far these have all been non-bank fintechs, have an account with it, a master account, which is absolutely necessary for taking part in these arrangements. Now, the Fed says it's doing this because stablecoins are dangerous, and it's got to protect the established network of dollar issuers, including itself, but also the regular banks, from instabilities introduced by stablecoin issuers. But this is a question-begging argument, of course, to the extent that The reason why we see instability in existing stablecoins, redeemable stablecoins, is because they are not in that playing field and are not subject to the same competitive pressures ordinary banks are. I think the Fed is being disingenuous and dishonest because we had a recent case where a stablecoin issuer, prospective stablecoin issuer, actually applied some time ago for a master account balance, promised to keep 100% reserves. That is, it was not going to be an ordinary bank. It was going to have 100% Fed balances backing its outstanding stablecoins. So this is quite a concession to make in the interest of ruling out trouble, ruling out potential damage to the rest of the system. And it was refused. And so if you won't let a stablecoin issuer take part in the US dollar-based clearing and settlement system, you're never going to see a safe US dollar stablecoin. And instead, you're going to drive all the stablecoin activity or keep it where it is, which is, as it were, overseas, outside of the official regulatory framework. And that's exactly the best way to perpetuate the instability of these currencies. Instead of letting them in, regulate them all you want, or let them regulate themselves in a way you should judge adequate, and then see how they do. By the way, in its arguments opposing this proposal, it's a long legal document because it was a court case. It's quite fascinating, but also rather annoying reading. The Federal Reserve, among other things, said they had to recognize, they're lawyers, they had to recognize that Custodia is the name of the firm. They had to recognize that this 100% reserve proposal is going to rule out the kinds of dangerous risk-taking behavior that has actually been the cause of trouble, not only in the cryptocurrency market, but all the recent bank failures. Here you had an institution that was not going to do any of the stuff that has caused banks to fail lately. So, that's pretty strong. So they recognized that, but their counter-argument was, well, we don't think they can make money with this alternative plan because they won't be making loans and earning that kind of interest, and therefore we don't think there are other ways they propose to make a profit are going to be adequate. Since when is it the job of a central bank to decide whether a bank can participate in its payment system based on its own speculation about whether the bank is going to be profitable or not, without any actual direct evidence that it's going to be dangerous? This seems to me completely new grounds. In fact, I should have said, the Fed, until the advent of stablecoins, with a couple recent exceptions for different reasons, has never refused a master account to any applicant that jumped through all the hoops necessary to become a legal depository institution, to get either a state or a federal charter. Has never refused a master account. Usually it happens in a week, 10 days. So, yeah. Oh, I thought it was 5:15. Oh, good gracious. I thought I only had 5:15. Anyway, I should stop. I'm very sorry. Anyway, I'll take questions now. I'm very sorry.